Welcome to the Insightful Investor Podcast, a weekly series that seeks to share industry, investment, and market insights. Learn more about our show at insightfulinvestor.org. As we wrap up 2025, I'm thrilled to share the top 10 insights from this year's episodes, ranked from 10 to 1. Just like we did at the end of 2024, we're continuing this tradition of reflecting on the most impactful ideas from the past year. We'll present these in two parts. Today's episode covers insights 10 through 6. Next week, in the final episode of the year, we'll reveal the top 5 insights of 2025. My goal is to spotlight some of the most valuable takeaways and give you a chance to revisit episodes you loved or discover ones you may have missed. Each insight was selected based on its impact, as noted by both myself and many of you who shared thoughtful feedback throughout the year. Whether you're revisiting or hearing these for the first time, I hope you find them as insightful as we did. Before we dive in, I want to express my gratitude to all of our listeners and guests. We launched this podcast 2 years ago, and it has exceeded every expectation. The show has been downloaded in 146 countries, with about 1/3 of episodes consumed outside of the United States. We recently celebrated our 100th episode, and we have a strong pipeline heading into 2026. On average, we see about 10 to 15,000 downloads or views per month, with over 6,000 subscribers. The most rewarding part of this journey has been learning from such a diverse group of guests. Our most downloaded episodes in 2025 featured Jeffrey Gundlach, Julian Brigden, Alan Waxman, Bob Prince, Adam Katz, John Gray, Jonathan Ruffer, Cliff Asness, and Rajiv Jain. If you haven't listened to these yet, they're definitely worth checking out. Most episodes include video content that's available on Spotify, YouTube, and the Insightful Investor website, so make sure to check those out. And as always, we welcome your feedback and suggestions for future guests as we continue to share insights in the years ahead. Finally, a quick note on our approach. I research each guest thoroughly, review their prior interviews and writings, and craft questions that I share in advance. This preparation ensures thoughtful conversations, and it's been an incredibly educational process for me, and I hope for you as well. Let's get started with the countdown. Here's insight number 10 from 2025. Number 10, manager value add. I've interviewed many investment managers about how they seek to add value, and while their strategies differ, they generally operate in one of two arenas, public markets or private markets. In public markets, most investors take a passive approach, so they often try to add value through stock selection. But persistent outperformance from picking individual stocks can be challenging and costly. After fees, net returns may be modest. In private markets, managers have a different opportunity. They can play a more active role by working with portfolio companies to improve operations, maybe structure creative financing, and try to drive strategic change. These efforts can strengthen businesses and in turn may benefit fund investors. Throughout the year, several guests shared thoughtful perspectives on this theme. Let's begin with the public market side and Eduardo Repetto, who is the CIO and co-founder of Avantis Investors. He explains how technology and systematic approaches have narrowed the gap between passive investing and traditional stock picking, bringing its benefits into a scalable, lower cost framework. The key takeaway, inefficiencies can still be captured, but not by knowing more than everyone else. Instead, they're exploited systematically through valuation and diversification. In this clip, Eduardo describes how technology has closed the gap between passive and active approaches in public markets, enabling systematic analysis at scale.
I know that it's philosophical, but it has a lot of insights because, we always think about index funds where the portfolio manager replicates the index and stock picking on the other side. But technology has allowed a lot of people that without having to do fundamental analysis, visiting companies, traveling around the world, speaking with the CFO, technology has allowed a lot of people to close that gap. So there is a lot that you can do today that years ago we would have thought that as a stock picking, but now you can do it in a very efficient way at a very low cost to analyze securities. One of the issues that you have when you're stock picking, that you want to speak with the CEO of a company, you have to travel around the world to want to speak with that. That's a very expensive proposition. So you have a high cost to analyze securities. So you finish with portfolios that are not as well diversified and with high expense ratio. If you are able to systematize that process, bring technology, bring a computer, bring data, and bring model to systematize the process, then you are analyzing those securities at a much lower cost. So what allows you to have way more diversified portfolios with low expense ratios and still have value added. And you can rebalance them on a daily basis if you need to, because the cost of analyzing the securities is low. And so what you have seen is that a lot of people, including us, have moved this technology, creating closer to what was stock picking before, and in my opinion, making it better because we can deliver portfolios that are more diversified and low expense ratios. So yes, the gap is getting closer and closer. And so what it puts a lot of pressure on the original stock picking guys, because the value add gets smaller, you have to reduce your fees, so you have to find a way to increase that value add, what is very difficult.
Next, he shares how he moves beyond isolated factors, integrating them into a holistic valuation framework.
If you have enough factors, you can always think about something as factors. But basically, what we have been trying to do is trying to link everything to evaluation of a company. So there are 400 factors that have been documented in the literature. There is a paper called the Factor Soup that's telling you how many out there. And the paper is 5 years old, so probably there are another 100 right now. But if you are having all these factors in isolation, they really don't tell you much. For me, all this factor analysis makes sense if then I can use that knowledge and put it back into evaluation of a company. Instead of saying I'm going to buy companies because they have low level of accruals, one factor, one variable that has been considered for, low level of accruals doesn't tell me much because you can have a company that has no accruals and supposedly high accruals is bad, but you can have a company that has low accruals but makes no money, the price is very high, and the balance sheet is full of liabilities. So yes, accruals is an important variable to take into account, a factor, let's say, but I need to put that in the context of the evaluation of the company. And that's what we're always trying to do, is trying to see all this research that is out there by others and by us. I'm not shy of saying by others. There are many academics out there that are doing a lot of research and trying to learn from all these variables, all these ratios that they find that have information, and try to see how can I use those ratios or these variables into evaluation framework that consider the company holistically, not just the balance sheet alone, not just the income statement, the company holistically, like if you were going to buy a company. And that's what we do day in and day out. And I'm not telling you what we do is perfect. Perfection is something impossible to reach. So tomorrow, hopefully, we do a better job. And a year after, a better job, because there is knowledge all the time coming to market.
Finally, I asked Eduardo how investors can seek out performance without relying on special insights or an information advantage.
One way that people think to outperform the market is because I know more than everyone else. Since I know more than everyone else, I know that this company is a gem. I'm going to buy it. Yeah. Maybe you know more than everyone else. Maybe you don't. How can we know that you know more than everyone else? There are millions of people that we don't even know that may know something about that company. So thinking that we know so much about one particular company more than everyone else, and everyone else is wrong selling that company at a price, and we should be better off buying it because the price should be much higher, that's a little bit arrogant when you're competing with tons of people that you don't even know who they are. So that investment style, we can link it to traditional stock picking, that will be persistent or not. I don't know, it's questionable. Historical data shows that after cost really doesn't work because the cost of doing that analysis is expensive. The approach I was saying is different. The approach I was saying is, look, the market is giving us the price of every company. If we compare that price with the information that we have with the balance sheet and the information of the cash flows, if that price is low, that company should have higher returns than another company that has similar balance sheet, similar cash flows, and a much higher price. And so I don't have some amazing insight about the CFO, the CEO, the clientele. I'm just using the market price and information on balance sheet and cash flows in order to identify what has high and lower expected return. And that should be persistent.
Next, we have Adam Katz. Adam is the co-founder and CIO of Irenic Capital, and he explains why he takes an activist approach, owning enough shares in public companies to actually influence management decisions and attempt to unlock value, rather than remaining a passive investor, which is far more common in public markets. Here's Adam.
How can a company be improved? One question, right? And if you think about, there are probably four or five different categories. One category is you can improve the operational performance of the business, right? The operating margins of the business might be lower than it should be based upon benchmarking to peers that operate in the same industry, right? So you might be earning 15% EBIT margins as opposed to 20% or 25% that your peers are earning. And maybe that's because you price your product incorrectly. And maybe that's because you have too many facilities and you got to consolidate facilities. Maybe that's because you have a bloated workforce and you need to cut costs, whatever it may be. So there's improving the operating performance of the business. And what we do in our investments is we bring in, almost like private equity does, and we bring in an operating partner, somebody from industry who helps us diligence the investment, diligence the business, and actually helps us put together a performance improvement plan for the company in which we're invested in. And so that person will help us figure out, okay, can we actually improve those operating margins? If we're going to improve those operating margins, how are we going to do it? That's one, operational improvement's one area. Second area might be capital allocation. You might have a business that's operated really well day to day, but they don't allocate capital all that intelligently. So they take free cash flow of the business and then they spend it on the pre-CapEx, let's call it pre-R&D, free cash flow of the business. And then they spend it on unnecessary capital expenditures. They spend it on wasteful R&D. They go out and do poorly considered, poorly thought through M&A, value destructive M&A. That's very common. There are a variety of different ways in which capital allocation can potentially be improved in a company. That's the second area. A third area can be just corporate governance. Just that, this is a company where the board doesn't have the right skill set to actually, steer the company for the long run. There could be ways in which the company might have a dual class share structure and then trade at a discount as a consequence. The company might be incorporated in a jurisdiction, unlike Delaware, that is an expanded constituency state and trades at a discount as a consequence of that. There may be a variety of ways in which you can improve the corporate governance. It might be a staggered board and you move to a de-staggered board. That's one where shareholders can sort of elect the board each year as opposed to a subset of directors each year. There are a variety of ways you can improve the corporate governance of a company. The fourth area in which it sounds kind of soft, but we see this a lot, is investor communication. Actually communicating to investors, communicating to market participants. This is what we do. This is how we do it. This is why we're a compelling investment opportunity. This is why you as an investor should entrust your capital to us. Those are kind of four different buckets in which to think about how we improve a company. It's obviously highly situation specific.
Now let's turn to private markets. Andrew Shiner is the founder and CEO of Altus Partners. And in his episode, he shares his perspective on how private equity managers can work closely with portfolio companies to support operational improvements and long-term strategic goals.
So I think that's one of the genuinely interesting things about the way we're able to invest as compared to investing in a widely held public company. We're looking to invest in businesses where we have the responsibility of ownership, the responsibility of governing these businesses. And we buy businesses where we have a clear perspective and thesis on what is required to be put in place to take this wonderful enterprise and take it to the next level. And philosophically, our view is that the most important decision that we make, and it's our responsibility, is who the CEO will be that will run this business. In venture capital, they often talk about backing a team. In a sense, we're not backing a team, we're buying a business that has real capabilities that we can underwrite and assess. And then the most important job is who the CEO will be that runs this company. Often the CEO is in place, but from time to time, we'll acquire a business where the plan is to either elevate somebody to that job or bring somebody new in. And that's the most important decision because they're going to be running the business day to day. And we need to understand that. With that CEO, we then need to align on the vision for the business so that we're very clear together on where we want to take it. And with that understood, Alex, we then are focused with the CEO on three things, right? What are the key priorities from one year to the next that we want, and the CEO agrees it's important for the senior leadership team to focus on over the course of the next 12 months. And those are going to evolve over time. So what are the key priorities? And then they're going to cascade priorities throughout the organization. What are the capabilities that are required to execute on those priorities? And I'll come back to capabilities in a moment. And then lastly, who are the people that we need within the organization to achieve all of that? Of those three, in many respects, I believe the most important is the team, the talent agenda. Because if we get the right team in place, then we're going to land on the right priorities and we're going to put the capabilities in place to execute on all of that. If we have the wrong team, we're going to suboptimize for sure. So where we're very focused is on the question of what capabilities are required, and those can be built internally, those can be brought to bear externally, or we can deliver those capabilities at our firm.
Finally, within the private market space, Bob Luzan, co-founder of Whitehawk Capital Partners, shares his perspective on asset-based lending. This approach is often used for companies that may not qualify for traditional cash flow lending. Many lenders avoid these situations because they view them as higher risk. But by lending against tangible assets rather than cash flow, Bob explains how the strategy can potentially provide financing options where others might not. Here's Bob.
When a company's generating cash flow, and that's probably 95+% of the lending market, they'll structure transactions based on how much they can afford to borrow, based on that leverage, on the amount of cash that they generate. When companies are no longer able to generate cash flow or sufficient cash flow, it kind of pushes them away from that market and into the arms of other types of lenders. Those lenders could be, someone like ourselves who say, hey, look, you have these assets. We'll lend you more capital or provide more liquidity to you because we're willing to lend against the value of those assets, not necessarily the book value that you have on your statements, but it would be more of a, call it a liquidation value. So we'll do an analysis to determine if I had to sell it as a lender, that asset, how much could I get for it? And then I'll lend money against that. So typically you would see, and it probably started a long time ago before I was even involved in this, the retail sector is a big ABL borrower, simply because if you think about it, all that inventory in all the stores is an asset and it turns very quickly. They may not generate cash flow throughout different seasons of the year, but there's certainly a lot of asset value inside the company. So they became predominantly asset-based borrowers. Now, 75-80% of our loans do not. They all perform and they pay us off as planned, either through a refinance or some other process that they were intending to do. The 20% that have gone into bankruptcy, we prepare for it day one. And we use bankruptcy counsel to write our credit docs, not necessarily because a corporate attorney can't provide that service, but we want to make sure that our document lives inside the bankruptcy codes day one. So that when a company does file for bankruptcy, we're not concerned about our credit document. We're more concerned about liquidity. And we can focus on liquidity with the company, either providing additional liquidity to run a process or making sure that the company can live inside the existing liquidity through cash collateral, use their own cash to run that process. So for us, it's not about, oh my gosh, the house on fire and we need to get everything out. We already have planned for that and we already know the escape routes. And the escape route, again, is through the asset conversion. A lot of companies and some companies have restructured inside bankruptcy and have emerged. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine with us. And that's our strategy, meaning that we're not a loan to own and we're not a loan to liquidate. We're more of a transitional or a rescue loan provider. If that loan helps provide you what you need to do to transition to the other side, great. If it doesn't, back to my earlier comment, we shouldn't be penalized for that. We're here to help. We're not here to take the company from you. We're not here to liquidate the assets unless need be, unless there's no other alternative. But bankruptcy doesn't scare us.
I then asked Bob why more lenders don't compete for these types of loans, driving down the potentially attractive yields that investors can earn for taking on this level of risk.
I think people do perceive that our loans are riskier because of the types of companies that we deal with. I would agree that the companies are riskier than some other companies that are out in the marketplace. I disagree on the risk level. There's a lot of work that goes into it to mitigate those risks, and we spend a lot of time monitoring throughout. These are not loans that you put in your drawer and you just collect a coupon. These are loans that you're hands-on. We have relationships with every single one of our borrowers. It doesn't mean that we're going to go out and have a beer with them, but they're relationships because we're their finance partner. They may not like the outcome all the time, but at the end of the day, we need to work together to either to resolve the issues at hand, which are underperformance or payback of the facility. I'm okay that people kind of look at us and think that our portfolio is much riskier than theirs. If all of my company's cash flow goes to zero tomorrow, I can still go home and I sleep at night. I don't worry about it. If I were a cash flow lender and all my companies went to zero, I would lose a lot of money. I just would.
Number 9, beyond the numbers, the soft side of wealth. In traditional wealth management, the focus has often been on numbers, investments, financial planning, and tax strategies. But for families who already have significant wealth, the real challenge often lies beyond cash flows and the balance sheet. There seems to be growing interest in integrating wealth with health, purpose, and happiness. This soft side of wealth management, addressing family dynamics, values, and well-being, is becoming just as important as investments and financial planning. 2 guests shared thoughtful perspectives on this theme. Let's start with Dr. Richard Orlando, the founder of Legacy Capitals, who works with families managing multi-generational wealth. He explains why preparing the family for wealth is just as important as preparing the wealth for the family. I asked Richard what this soft side looks like in practice. One tool Richard uses is a family charter. Listen to him here.
So part of what we do is a little bit of education. What's the difference between an owner versus an operator versus a family member? What are the responsibilities? What's the governance that wraps around that? And then in some families, I'm oversimplifying, but this is a good indication, we help them create their family charter or their family constitution.
Of course, these conversations raise big questions for families, questions that go far beyond technical planning and investments. Richard shared some of the most common concerns he hears.
In addition to help me grow my assets, protect my assets, minimize my tax, minimize my risk, those are all foundational. I'm going to speak on in addition. The other questions that are the ones that I was hinting at before that we heard in so many ways over and over again. I'd say the top 3 to 5 questions are talk about our wealth with our kids. Do we? Because, and behind that question is mostly fear, some curiosity, but because if they knew how much wealth we have and how much wealth they might be responsible for one day or have access to, we might create entitlement unintentionally. One of the biggest questions is how and when do we talk about this? Another one is how do we prepare the next generation? What are we preparing them for is really the opening question. But how do we prepare them? They're busy, they're young, they might be 7 years old, they might be 27 years old, they might be 47 years old. By 47, hopefully some work has been done, but each family is slightly different. But preparing the next generation is really important. How do I transfer my wealth? And not necessarily technically, because there's a lot of smart people that could do that, but do I share some while we're alive? Do I invest in a business for my children? What criteria does the business plan need to have? Do we wait till we're dead and that's it? If you're choosing to give whatever amount of money or access or income from maybe a trust to your loved ones, is it a gift or is it a transfer? And the distinction I make, if it's a gift, then make it a gift. It's like you gave them a Christmas gift or a birthday gift. Hopefully they're appreciative, but there's no strings attached. But if there's meant to be strings attached, I'll call that a transfer. In other words, there's a certain minimum expectation of accomplishment in your life, or maybe it's a certain level of education or whatever it is. And you have some strings attached to it. They have to be a good steward of it. They can't be abusing substances. Then that's a transfer. And I try to make the case that in some cases, what I've learned from serving families is it's probably better to, as one of the, I can still hear this, I think she was G5 or G4. She said to her parents, which would have been, I think, G3 at the time, the fact that you opened up the spigot for me over the years helped me be more ready for what I'm now aware of. So whether to open this spigot means you paid for my college and then you gave me a little bit of income to live in New York City or LA and you paid for my wedding.
Richard also highlighted the strong connection between wealth and happiness and why families often need guidance to focus on behaviors that foster a meaningful, flourishing life.
It's now becoming much more understood and known. I just surveyed the happiness research plus my own experience, and I wrote a chapter on happiness. What I tried to do is take the research and then translate it to what a family or an individual could do about it. At the end of the chapter, I think I list 10 behaviors or attitudes that contribute to a meaningful, flourishing life or a happy life. So, for example, achievement. So, for someone to experience achievement contributes to a meaningful, happy life. So, how do you translate that? Well, if I have enough resources and I make it really easy for my kids, I'm actually possibly robbing them of struggle. So, we want them to have achievement. Maintaining a mindset of gratitude. My kids are a bit older now, although we still do it, but sometimes you might just sit around the table with your loved ones, whether they're 7 years old or Thanksgiving dinner, and everyone talk about what they're grateful for. Practicing gratitude, giving or sharing with others is another attribute in the happiness research, which is, we don't get credit for this, but time, talent, or treasure. Not every family member is at a place where they can give away their financial assets because they might not have any. They might be a working student or not even a working student, just a student. But how do they contribute back to others? Forgiveness, forgiving others. There's 10 that I list, but these are 3 or 4. Having a clear purpose. Dr. Seligman talks about, and he's the professor at Wharton, that talks about understand your what he calls your signature strengths.
One of the most pressing concerns Richard hears from parents is how to keep their children motivated without creating entitlement.
This is one of those questions that really keeps parents up at night. And it's an important one because when families and parents and entrepreneurs have significant wealth, they can take care of a lot of things in their kids' lives. And so, how do you keep them motivated when you could have the resources to take care of something? So, a few things, and it's also related to some of what we've talked about regarding the attributes of a happy and meaningful life. But to keep motivated is things like help them, give them opportunities to be challenged and to overcome and to achieve. The achievement piece keeps the motivation. Another guiding principle as a parent is that just because we can take care of things, it doesn't mean we should. Or I have this expression, do we love our children enough not to give them everything we can? And so the idea there is imagine in some ways that your parenting is you don't have access to the resources you do. How would you then guide your kid? What would you expect from them? What would be your counsel to them when they're in a tough situation and they want to back out? Part of that practically is having them work and earn. A lot of parents may not do that, for example, if their children are at the age of university or college, but sometimes they will. Or I've even worked with 1 or 2 families where they said to their children, even though they could have paid for everything, they said, we're going to pay for 90% of school. You're going to pay for 10%. And as long as you maintain a B or higher, we'll pay for the 90%. But if it's anything lower than a B, it goes into your 10%. Most parents don't do that, but I would say that motivation piece is to help them identify their passions, their strengths, their goals, encourage, challenge, support, but help them achieve it as best they can within their own efforts. And I think that helps a lot. What we find over time, because what you do for a 7-year-old is not what you might do for a 17-year-old or a 37-year-old. But the general principle, and it's related to some of our conversation already, is this idea of if there are significant family resources, and that is the concern, that how do we make sure these are used to serve our kids and help them flourish, not make them entitled or lose their work ethic, as some parents might say, is that you almost move towards transparency and even in terms of access. So maybe there's a payment for school that's fully covered, but now after that, maybe there's a co-down payment on a house, not a buying of the house. Or some of our clients will help make sure that there's enough of a down payment on a house so that their children live in a community that's safe and maybe even near them. But then the children have to be able to have enough income to maintain the lifestyle and expenses to carry the home. So you just keep moving towards that progression over time.
Paul Pagnato is a former scientist and longtime financial advisor turned longevity expert and founder of Humanot Health and Transparency Global. In his episode, he reminded us that true wealth goes beyond money. He explains why longevity is often misunderstood and shares practical steps anyone can take to live a longer, healthier life.
So many of us have different life experiences, and we process what longevity means. Some of us may think that's, living in a nursing home and not being able to walk around and being in pain. And others process it's something very, very different. So for me, I view true longevity more of a health span and a lifespan, living a long quality life. Today, there is over 900,000 people over the age of 100. And these individuals, I've met them from all over the world. These individuals are playing cards, they're going on walks, they're playing not just with their children and grandchildren, but great grandchildren. And they're active, they're spry, they're laughing. So to me, that's true longevity, enjoying life in your 80s, 90s, 100s.
And what do you think are the biggest misperceptions that people have about when you talk about health span versus lifespan?
Our ability to get there, one's ability and mindset to actually accomplish that. In 1880, the average life expectancy was only 38. So most people think of maybe their grandparents that didn't live so long and just don't have that mindset that we can. Again, over 900,000 people can do it, can make it. And that number is exponentially increasing every single year. So the perception that we can't, or the perception that it's going to fall off, is just not the case. With Stanford, the last 3 years, I'm fortunate to know Dr. Laura Cardison there. She founded the Center on Longevity and have done some profound work. And the biggest project has been the new map of life. And the new map of life is individuals living to 100 plus and being able to constantly reinvent ourselves, being able to go back to school, learn a new career path, a profession, and do that, and then go do it again and again and again. So there's this new map of life that we're all needing to live, and it's a change of a mindset.
I asked Paul what practical steps individuals can take to improve their health span. Here's what he shared.
I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. We hear about these very wealthy billionaires that are spending an absorbent amount of money to biohack, to live longer, to hit escape velocity and live forever. The reality is 90% of it are things that are free and that everyone can do in the world. There are some foundational pillars to living a long quality life. And whether it's Stanford University Center on Longevity, whether it's the work by Dan Buettner in the Blue Zones, to other major universities like Harvard, there's a consensus theme that our ability not to stress is like one of the most important pillars. And that doesn't cost money not to stress. In fact, just the opposite tends to happen. When you have a lot of money, you stress out over a lot of things. Secondly is sleep. It doesn't cost anything to go to bed, to get a good night's rest. Third is movement, to go for a walk outside. And whether it's 5,000 steps or 8,000 steps or 10,000 steps, no one's going to charge you to go for a walk. Some of the most important pillars that these centenarians have lived their life by are free. They don't cost any money, and all of us can do them.
You talked about the blue zones earlier, and you gave us a little snippet about what they reveal about longevity. Is there any more that you can share?
So there are some common denominators, some common traits. One of them is they tend to be slightly elevated. They tend to be 500 to 800 feet up. And when you go there, you see the result of that is they're very mountainous, hilly, and people are climbing. I have literally seen, I don't know how old they were, but they looked older, with a walker, like climbing up a hill. Like this is what they've done their whole life, and they're going to continue to do it. Being able to have some elevation, and if you live on the water, that's okay. There's a stair stepper, right? There's things you can do to have that. So that's one common denominator amongst all of them. The second is they tend to follow the normal circadian rhythm, the cycle of the sun rising and the sun setting. That's how our bodies have been programmed for thousands of years. We are used to going to bed when the sun goes down and getting up when the sun comes up. But Thomas Edison and others introduced these blue lights, these light bulbs that we have, which is artificial. And our body to this day has not synced up with that. Our circadian rhythm is such that when our eyes see the sunlight, that's when our circadian rhythm turns on. You'll find in these blue zones, they tend to follow the natural process. Next is the natural eats. They're just not consuming processed goods. They're living off of the land. They're living off of natural goods. They don't need bottled water there. In Arles, France, the water right from the Rhone River there is super, super clean. And that's just table water, it's like mineral water. So they tend to be really eating unprocessed foods. And that means, minimal amount of sugar. So there's a few examples of themes amongst all the blue zones that I've traveled to.
Number 8, the math and the mind, a practical investment framework. Managing a portfolio is both science and art. The math is about sound principles and rational frameworks. The mind is about overcoming behavioral pitfalls. In my experience, the best investors balance both, creating strategies that work in practice in the real world. Bob Prince, co-CIO of Bridgewater Associates, one of the largest hedge funds in the world, explains that managing risk isn't just about returns. It's about avoiding outcomes that fall outside what you consider acceptable. He emphasizes the importance of defining those boundaries and holding firm to your strategy, even when external pressures may tempt you to stray.
I think the answer is different if you're a professional investment manager managing somebody else's money and you're being held to that as a benchmark, versus if you're managing your own money and you have some other purpose for your savings. But I think if you're actually held to a benchmark, you're a professional manager, you're held to a benchmark, you need to explicitly know how much tracking error you're going to have relative to that benchmark. And you might actually, even if it makes for a less efficient portfolio, you might actually have to hold some of that asset in order to measure the proper amount of tracking error, right? And so that's, we have to do that when that's what's called for. It's nice to have the freedom to not do that, right? It's much better to have the freedom to just say, I'm going to build the most efficient portfolio, the highest return per unit of risk, the lowest probability of hitting the adverse outcome that I referred to earlier. And, we do these things we call a cone chart, right? Which is like, what is my range of outcomes over time? And as long as I'm inside that range, I'm achieving my own goals. And I have to be making my decisions based on my goals, what I need the money for, how much risk I can take, and build this strategy for that. Not, what somebody else might have done or what I could have done or something like that, because that will draw you into the mistakes that everybody else is making. And like I said today, what everybody is doing effectively, what the average person is doing, is holding a highly concentrated portfolio in a limited number of stocks in the United States, and taking a lot of risk in doing that. And the problem with risk, you only feel it after the fact. And after the fact, you can't do anything about it. The time to manage your risk is before things happen that are unacceptable. So you have to know your unacceptable outcome, and you have to know whether your portfolio or your investment strategy is going to be inside that cone of what's acceptable.
Liz Ann Saunders, the longtime chief investment strategist at Charles Schwab, reminds us that the hardest part of investing isn't knowing what to do, it's having the discipline to do it. I asked her why the core principles of investing, maintaining a long-term perspective, staying diversified, and rebalancing, can be so difficult to follow in practice. Listen to Liz Ann.
Because it's our money and we have emotional attachment to our money. And it tends to, I think, exacerbate those natural emotions of fear and greed, which tend to infiltrate investment decision making. And, ideally, what investors can do is not figure out the hard way whether there is a wide or narrow gap between what we could think of as financial risk tolerance, what's on paper. We sit down with an advisor, we map out a long-term strategy. It involves your financial risk tolerance. But then there's the emotional risk tolerance. And unfortunately, a lot of investors learn the hard way that there's a pretty yawning gap between those two. And it is those classic emotions of fear and greed. And it's why those tried and true disciplines, you mentioned diversification, such a key one, and then periodic rebalancing, which forces us to go against those emotions. It forces us to essentially do a version of buy low, sell high. It's add low, trim high. Of course, often when left to our own devices, we do the opposite, and that's where those emotions of fear and greed tend to come in. I phrase it in terms of one of the mistakes that investors make, and it has to do with the connectivity between time horizon and risk tolerance. And I think too often investors think that there's a direct link between your time horizon and your risk tolerance, meaning if you're young, you're automatically a risk tolerant investor and you should take a more aggressive stance, vice versa if you're on the older end of the spectrum. But actual tolerance for risk is more than just about time horizon. You can be a 30-year-old investor and still have a long time horizon before, say, retirement. But if at the first 10 or 15% drop in your portfolio, that fear factor is going to kick in and you panic and sell, I don't care how long your time horizon is, you are not a risk tolerant investor.
Jeff Gardner, former partner at Bridgewater, highlights the behavioral side, why even the best math can be derailed by human emotion and psychological traps. Here's Jeff.
I would think about the idea of your risk tolerance. So you mentioned this already, Alex, but I have seen so many times when people invest in something and say, well, I'm holding this for diversification purposes, but then they really can't tolerate losing money in that, or it goes on for too long and they get rid of it oftentimes right before it actually would have really benefited them to hold on to it. And so you have to really deeply understand, what do I expect from these things? And, what does a bad period look like? And then try to step away from that. And as you said, try not to be too emotional about the actual results you experience versus having confidence in that longer term plan that you've built.
On the other side, Paul Podolsky, founder of Cape Capital and former Bridgewater strategist, shared why, at times, trusting your instincts could be valuable.
It's true that most people say, again, to the way investing, we have a disciplined approach, we have a long-term, blah, 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 we're not, blah, blah. And the whole idea is that emotion is really disastrous for investing. And certainly emotion can be disastrous for investing. That's true. But I think about it a little bit differently, which is that we've been given this unbelievably powerful mind, and it has a very Darwinian survival instinct to it. And if you listen to it, it can have really relevant information. People will say sometimes, this happened to my wife once, people have a sense, I've heard this particularly from women, that I was in a spot and something didn't feel right. And I just decided to take a cab, or, I got out of that situation fast. And this actually came up when I was writing, one of the books is a fiction. It's a spy book that I wrote, Master Minion. And I talked to an actual CIA officer about this when I was doing it. And I had invented these techniques for the main character to be aware when he was being followed. He was in Russia, where I'd spent a lot of time. And the agent said to me, he said, if you're any good as an agent, if you're being followed, you know it. He said, you just know it. And that really struck me, that on some intuitive level, if somebody's after you. And I think that the same thing could happen in markets too. That if you're operating out of fear and reactive, that's not good. But if you really listen to, wow, I think that it could be extraordinarily good, like this whole AI thing. People have obviously made a ton of money when they were like, wow, this is going to be transformational, until recently when they were on the long side. Or it could be something bad, that bonds are going to go down a lot, or stocks are going to go down a lot, or whatever it is. And so I believe listening to those things is important.
Number 7, are markets becoming less efficient? Conventional wisdom suggests markets become more efficient over time. Yet this year, 2 guests offer compelling insights on why the opposite may be true. Cliff Asness, founder and CIO of AQR Capital Management, argues that while technology has made markets faster, it may have also made them more prone to bubbles and behavioral excess. And the market may be less efficient today than in the past. Listen to his rationale here.
My belief is over my career. And again, I'm using my own career, but what else are you going to use? That's my life experience, which is now 34 years of live results since my dissertation. I think the market has gotten less, not more efficient. And I love the way you asked the question about technological change, because I start out the whole piece saying, like many of my readers, I probably started thinking markets should get more efficient over time, because technology leads to more efficiency in so many things. Information is in all of our hands, close to instantly, close to ubiquitously. So it had to have gotten more efficient. But then two things. I've observed that over my career, these two periods I keep whining about, 99, 2000, and then 19 and 20, were respectively in highly measurable ways the most extreme mispricings, in our opinions, we've ever seen, going back near 100 years. So that's not too consistent with a market that's gotten more, not less efficient. Those are just two data points. But as we say in the formal statistical world, they're two freaking big data points. Influential data points is the more technical term for that. So, I thought markets have gone crazy twice in my career. I would not have guessed they'd go that crazy. I would not have said no chance. Hopefully, I'd be smart enough to go never say no chance in this business. I found 99, 2000 a surprise. And I found 2019, 20 a bigger surprise, because we had seen the same thing a mere 20 years ago. That's not 100 years. 20 years later, people like me and people like me will still be around. So to see something as extreme happen again made me think something has made the markets a little odder. The next thing about technology is when I thought about it more, at least I came to the conclusion that technological advances are mostly about speed. Do I believe information gets into prices faster than 34 years ago? Yeah. We're probably talking if not nanoseconds, when we used to talk minutes, when an earnings announcement would come out. But when I started my career, I'm old, but it wasn't the Stone Age. We had telephones and faxes. We had Bloombergs. Information got in pretty darn quickly. So the difference between 10 minutes and 10 milliseconds matters a lot if you're a so-called high-frequency trader, because your world has gotten faster and faster. But if you're talking about medium to long-term mispricings, doesn't matter for a hill of beans. It's not about that. You can make or lose a lot of money on mispricings while waiting a week to do every trade from when you decide to, because it's a slow-moving world. So immediately it was like technology's not really relevant to this general level of mispricing question. And I ended up deciding even more counterintuitively that some forms of technology have contributed to this increase in what I think is market inefficiency. And here I particularly mean social media, instantaneous 24-hour trading on your phone in a gamified fashion. I'm fond of saying, if you're up at 4 a.m. on a Saturday night and you just need 3 more shares of NVIDIA, I'm not sure your financial planning is on firm ground. Social media, though, in particular, I pick on that a lot. I know I sound like an old man harumphing about social media, but market efficiency, while you should never assume perfect market efficiency, but a fairly efficient market has always depended on some idea of the famous wisdom of crowds. That individuals may make mistakes, and I could point to people doing crazy things, but the crowd itself is wise and will take the other side on net of mistakes and arbitrage them down, if not fully away. A wise crowd has a crucial assumption behind it that is usually stated, but sometimes left out, that the crowd is relatively independent of each other. That's why you get a good decision. If the crowd all gets to talk to each other, maybe you still get a good decision. Maybe the people who know the answer convince the people who are wrong. But maybe you get an angry, crazy mob, too. And again, these are taglines, but I like to say, has there ever been anything in history better than modern social media for turning a potentially wise crowd into a potentially dangerous mob. So I think market efficiency in general, and particularly some of these extremes, which is even more relevant of what I think are bubble-like behavior, have been exacerbated by a fair amount of our technological environment. I'm not a pessimist long-term. I think with a lot of big technological change, the world tends to adapt over time. We may be stupid about it for a while, but eventually we figure out that it's leading us astray. So I'm not a total nihilist, but I do think in the immediate term and for the last 20 to 35 years, particularly the last 20, I do think the technological environment has contributed to less, not more, market efficiency.
And I suppose the meme stock example is a pretty extreme case that highlights what you just said.
You're exactly right. I just call it the apotheosis of my thesis. I don't like pointing to the most extreme. That's why I didn't lead with it. You know, it's not fair arguing, pointing to the single craziest thing and saying, see, I'm right. So I don't take this as proof positive. You know, the spreads between cheap and expensive, adjusted for maybe quality and growth differences that got so extreme that we look at are across thousands of stocks around the world, diversified by industry. It is not about the meme stocks. But the meme stocks are probably a poster child for your social media driven extreme irrationalities. So, yeah, I fully agree with that. But I don't want to oversell the case. They're the poster child. They're not the driving force.
He also shared what a less efficient market could mean for investors.
What does it mean? It means the mispricings will be bigger on occasion. 99, 2000 saw spreads as we measure them. And this was very robust. Other people came up with their own ways to measure them after us, between cheap and expensive, getting to record levels, and then in many scales surpassing those records in 2020 and early 2021. That means to an investor who can stick with what they do, who's rational, who's taking the other side of these emotions, they should make more money long term. Think of it this way. If the markets were perfectly efficient, there's no such thing as alpha. That's one way to think of perfect efficiency. So if markets are wildly inefficient, someone who can stick with betting against them should eventually be rewarded more than if they're mildly inefficient. But you've probably already guessed the second part. If they can get to more extremes, and like we talked about in the very beginning, if those extremes can last longer, it's going to be harder to stick with these strategies. Not that the world cares what I find fair or not, but in a weird way, I find this a remarkably fair trade-off. Harder to survive and do and stick with, but more lucrative for those who can. That's the way markets work, baby. You can't get away from that trade-off. It often works that way.
Su Xuan Tan, founder of Discern Group, explains why today's markets may be showing greater signs of inefficiency, particularly through what he calls the time horizon arbitrage. His firm focuses on companies with a truly long-term outlook, aiming to capitalize on general investor impatience.
Here, we focus on what the companies do, not on what they say. We look for companies with thick rather than thin cultures, and I use air quotes here because it's a term of art. At companies with thick cultures, the corporate mission and value statements are lived out and experienced by their stakeholders. When you talk to their employees, they can recount how the company's commitment to these statements drove important decisions. At companies with thin cultures, employees are hard-pressed to even recall what the mission and the values are. We also admire companies that have this continuous improvement gene, that they're willing to try to tinker with new things. They're willing to fail, but they fail smart and they fail quickly. They seldom bet all on red in the hope that red turns up, even though companies who make these big bets sometimes get the front page of Wall Street Journal, most followers on X, etc. So they get all the glory. But the people who try to work on continuous improvement, they're often quieter. We seek out companies who willingly and consistently trade short-term gains for long-term ones. There's a delayed gratification gene. They reinvest in customer price rebates and improved offerings. They reinvest in their employees via training and retention tools. They reinvest in the future via R&D and capital expenditure, even though shareholders often don't like that. So in many ways, they behaved in the exact opposite way that most private equity roll-ups do. We joke about this. Why is it an arbitrage at all? It's just common sense. And yet, here we are.
Number 6, lessons from market history for today's investor. Most investors don't know the history of markets, but those who do may gain a powerful perspective. What can we learn from past crises, bubbles, and recoveries? And how can those lessons help us navigate today's uncertainty? Jonathan Ruffer, co-founder and chairman of Ruffer, reflects on his 50 years of investing and deep study of history. He begins by discussing historical analogs to today's environment.
When I said, what's happening in the markets now feels like a combination of two things: the dot-com boom at the turn of the century and the Nifty 50 boom of a generation before that. And the thing that caught the dot-com boom out was that people bought the wrong companies. They bought young companies, which, however cleverly placed they are always vulnerable, because new businesses, particularly in frontier industries, need a lot of cash, and the cash isn't always available. Whereas the Nifty 50, the market, so they absolutely got the idea that online was going to replace retail. So they got the phenomenon right, but they played the wrong stocks. And in the Nifty 50, they absolutely got the right stocks. 48 out of those 50 really were, a generation later, the great stocks of America. So they picked the right stocks, but by paying the wrong price, they were absolutely done for. So if you turn that on its head, I think that probably explains why I didn't spend enough time trying to find the next NVIDIA or, the next Walmart or the next this or that, because I can have more success or lack of success by playing valuations.
I then asked Jonathan whether long periods of prosperity create conditions for future instability, when risk-taking and short-term thinking rise at the expense of long-term resilience.
I do think prosperity is a more dangerous phenomenon for all of us. It isn't just investment accounts than adversity, because adversity is something that the human spirit rails against and wants to see corrected. Whereas prosperity invites you to be a lotus eater. And if it ain't broke, why mend it? Well, by the time you've driven your car without having it serviced for 8 years, don't be surprised if when it breaks down, the guy at the garage says, buy another one.
Jonathan also shared fascinating insights on the historical shifts in power between capital and labor, and how that pendulum has swung over time, and the key turning points behind those reversals.
To think of an entity that creates value as having two possible owners. Either it's the guy who puts the factory up, or it's the guys who work in the factory. One or other both have, in the theory of things, a claim to ownership. And the communists say they all ought to belong to the workforce. And the capitalism says, no, they have to seem right, but actually the business belongs to the person who put the capital into the business. Now, I park that, but I note that. And if you go back back to the Black Death is usually the place that people start. There's a very, very good book written by somebody called Hackett Fisher in the 1990s, which whenever I'm feeling rather pleased with myself, I go and have a read of. So I've read it again and again. But what is very striking about that is that the interplay between capital and labor seems to operate on about a 50-year cycle. And sometimes capital absolutely has the stranglehold. And then, 50 years later, it's labor that has the stranglehold. And because once the pendulum has swung, it goes on swinging absolutely everywhere geographically until the thing has become so extreme that the pendulum is almost forced to swing back. If you look at it through an English prism, the mid-1970s was the absolute high watermark of the unions. We used to go and have beer and sandwiches with the Prime Minister. And if you and I were setting up a business and we discovered the source of life and we thought, well, should we invest in that? We'd think, well, why bother? Because all that will happen is that if it fails, we'll do badly. And if it succeeds, our workforce will capture all the benefit of it. And November 2021 seemed to me to be the high watermark of capitalism, in the sense that winner takes all, that the amount of wealth that was earned by incredibly few people absolutely matched America in the early 1890s, before the trusts were busted. That was a point when the extraordinarily rich were as rich as they were ever going to get. So the reason I'm interested in this is because I'm an inflationist. I think inflation is coming back. And inflation is always quiescent when the commercial world is in charge, and is always dominant when the workforce is in charge.
Andrew Metrick. He's a professor at Yale and director of the Yale Program on Financial Stability. And he delivered a master class on financial crisis in his episode, a conversation I highly recommend. He begins by explaining recurring patterns behind banking crises.
History of banking crises is often something like a history of new types of money, new types of getting into this business gone bad. What will typically happen is what we call shadow banks, which are institutions that are engaged in the banking activity of borrowing short and lending long, but not formally banks. The shadow banks will come in because it's so lucrative to be in there. And then when they collapse, we'll say, well, we don't have to worry about it. They're outside the banking system. They're shadow banks, only to find out that they touched the banking system.
Next, Andrew describes how after long periods of calm, people tend to start to believe they can operate at higher and higher levels of risk.
To the extent that your system goes decades without anything happening like that, people start to believe more and more that they can operate at a higher and higher level of risk in this system with a smaller amount of equity capital protecting the depositors, because these things just don't happen anymore. So it's the famous way to say this, not of my invention, but often attributed to Minsky, is that stability creates its own instability, like forests that don't have a fire, and the trees grow drier and drier and drier. And so even the smallest spark can set off a big fire.
Andrew then shared his perspective on the major forces behind the global financial crisis, insights that could potentially help us identify factors worth monitoring today.
But ultimately, it's the very unsatisfying macro forces that were the biggest drivers. The macro forces that were extant at the time really track back to the 1990s. If you remember, you seem younger than me, Alex, so maybe you don't. But in the 1990s, we had the peace dividend, and we were actually running, it's hard to believe when you tell it to young people, budget surpluses in the United States. And we were having conversations, believe it or not. What will we do to anchor interest rates when the United States government has retired its debt? What are we going to do? We were actually in a world where the amount of government debt outstanding, which we talked about earlier as maybe being the base for the whole banking system in some cases, banks could just invest in that it's a very, very safe way to underlie the collateral system. There was much less of it relative to the demand. And at the same time that was happening, there was a global demand for that stuff that was getting very large from countries like China and the oil-producing countries. What Ben Bernanke called in his pre-Fed chair days, the global savings glut. The global savings glut collided with there not being as much supply, natural supply of U.S. government securities, and gave an enormous incentive to the private sector to manufacture substitutes for government securities, to find a way to package and to repackage different forms of collateral to give people things that could be used as a substitute for government bonds. And that's what they did. There's no better business in the world than you'll give me money and I give you virtually nothing in return. If what I'm giving you is the ability to transact and the convenience of something that looks like money, then I can give it to you and pay a very low interest rate. And a lot of the things that were manufactured through the system, they weren't manufactured because bankers suddenly got greedy. We're all greedy all the time, but the opportunity to put that greed to work was because of these enormous macro forces that aren't usually there. You can throw some people in jail, you can make certain things against the law. When somebody can make that many basis points on that many trillions of dollars, it's going to happen somewhere in the financial system. So we ended up with a banking system that wasn't inside the regulated banks. Effectively, we disintermediated a lot of what banks had previously done into a whole chain of acronyms and interventions that at one end was taking savings and at the other end was throwing out investment. But nowhere along the chain was anything that looked exactly like a traditional bank. But like traditional banks, they're subject to runs and they're subject to solvency, viability concerns. And when those popped, the panic was a very inefficient way to discipline that system. I have a whole course where I teach this. And when the course is over, to demonstrate how effectively I teach it, a lot of my students say, can you sum this up really in a couple paragraphs? And unfortunately, it's hard because it's not nearly as satisfying or as theatrical as what you can do in The Big Short or Inside Job documentary. And a lot, I think, of the hardest problems to solve in the world are complicated that way. As humans, we really prefer narratives where there's people to blame and not systems.
I asked Andrew about the biggest risks he sees in today's environment.
By far, the biggest risk that we have right now is to the sustainability of the fiscal path in the United States, and thus the role of Treasury securities and the dollar at the core of the global financial system. That's a major, major first order concern that dwarfs anything else. And I want to say that this is something people should be concerned about no matter what their politics are, no matter who they voted for. Both political parties in the United States have plenty of blame for the situation that we are in now. There has not been a party of fiscal responsibility in the United States for a really long time. A party that said they were a fiscal responsibility wasn't, and a party that denied that fiscal responsibility was necessary has gotten even more aggressive at it. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have covered themselves in glory, and there is not one president or one administration that one can pin the blame on for this place that we're in now. But it does appear, since the United States became the global financial center, bond markets for the first time showed reticence to hold as much U.S. government debt under the fiscal path that we had set out. They showed the first time reticence for that. But that might have been the first time that conversation reached an investment committee, actual asset allocation level at a critical mass of places. And that's a meaningful step. And again, there were very specific things that happened in April, but there's a long history of this in the United States. It's not as though one president, one administration made a decision and caused all of this. We have been building this house of cards for a long time, wondering at what point there would be instability noticed by markets. And it appears to have happened. We've been given that warning. The UK received that warning when they had their mini budget and their gilt crisis. We received it in a less extreme form, but we're a bigger place in April. The largest risk to the system is that the connection between markets and fiscal decisions that we make will be sufficiently strained. I think that what we've done so far, there's a part of it that's irreversible. That decision to go from 20% to 15% or whatever is not something that people will immediately say, oh, all right, the problem's done. I think the U.S., no matter what we do in the next 5 years, I don't see people saying, I'm sure the U.S. will be fine for the next 50 years. There's nothing we can do to get back what maybe we had 30 years ago when people thought we might not have debt anymore, or I should say 25 years ago. I think that we've done some harm to that position of U.S. Treasuries and the dollar, some harm that's not coming back. The biggest risk is, will we do more? The markets have certainly sent a warning flare to us that has not been sent before in our time of hegemony of the global financial system. And we would be wise to heed that and to proceed with some caution in terms of what we're telling the world about our fiscal path and our seriousness as economic stewards of this privilege that we have in this dollar system. And again, this is a bipartisan issue. It's happening now under one administration, but it's not a new process. It is inherited from the last administration, which inherited from the last, which inherited from the one before that.
And to close the interview, I asked Andrew if a crisis worse than the global financial crisis could occur. Here's what he said.
A crisis where at its core is a loss of confidence in U.S. government securities is a conflagration beyond anything that we have experienced in the modern capitalist economy. It's beyond the Great Depression. There is not a currently available substitute to base the global financial system off of, which is why those investment committees couldn't go from 20% holdings down to zero. But if suddenly there's real lack of confidence, the bond markets add a risk premium onto U.S. government securities that is large and permanent, there's not really a reaction to that. Government's ability to intervene in financial crises is totally predicated on their ability to manufacture safe assets to replace the unsafe ones circulating out in the system. You can't do that if you're the source of that problem. And in the past, there were wealthy countries that could help the less wealthy countries when it happened to them. There's nobody with the capacity to help the United States if that happens. And there's nobody with the capacity to step up and fill whatever vacuum is left if we're not playing that role. So that is the largest concern. And as I said, it dwarfs all the other stuff. It dwarfs crypto and cyber risk and any of the other private credit, any of the other stuff that is changing and could be a problem. But those are normal types of problems and slow growing sectors that aren't going to bring the whole global financial system down with them. But the base of that system is the dollar and US treasuries. And it's reasonable for people to be worrying about that now.
Well, that wraps up the first part of our top 10 insights of 2025, where we counted down numbers 10 through 6. I hope you'll join me next week for our final episode of the year when we reveal the top 5 insights. Thank you. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please visit our website at insightfulinvestor.org to access past shows and learn more about our podcast. If you have questions, feel free to email us at info@insightfulinvestor.org. And if you enjoyed the discussion, please subscribe to this podcast to ensure you don't miss future episodes. And don't forget to forward today's conversation to others you think would enjoy listening. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Evoke advisors, their affiliates, or companies featured. Due to industry regulations, participants on this podcast are instructed not to make specific trade recommendations, nor reference past or potential profits. And listeners are reminded that securities trading, commodity trading, and alternative investments are complex and carry a risk of substantial losses. As such, they are not suitable for all investors. Listeners should be aware that guests featured on The Insightful Investor may have current or past associations with Evoke advisors or the host, including as an investment manager of a private fund opportunity by Evoke, or access through an affiliated Evoke fund, or as a client. Participation as a guest on the podcast should not be perceived as an endorsement or testimonial with respect to Evoke advisors, the podcast host, or their services. Similarly, the inclusion of a guest on the podcast does not imply that Evoke advisors or the host endorses the guest or any company with which they may be affiliated or employed. Evoke has neither paid nor received compensation from guests for their participation.